We're now going to consider two other kinds of arguments that are importantly different from deductive arguments. Now recall from the previous video, for a deductively valid argument, what that means is that we have certainty of the truth of the conclusion. We have a kind of guarantee that the conclusion is true. It must be true. Now with inductive arguments, that's not the case. An inductive argument is not a deductively valid one. And the reason why is because it could be the case that the conclusion is false, even while all of the premises are true. So for an inductive argument, what we have, instead of a guarantee of truth, is we have a kind of high probability of truth, but not an absolute guarantee of truth. And the other kind of argument that we're going to be concerned with is what's called an abductive argument. An abductive argument is an argument that basically appeals to the best explanation for some given phenomenon. So the two kind of arguments that we're going to be concerned with now are inductive arguments and abductive arguments. And these are importantly different from deductive arguments because with induction and abduction, we do not have a guarantee of the truth of the conclusion. We only have a high probability that the conclusion is true. So consider the following kind of argument. Let's say that you're traveling all over the world and every single place you've ever been, you've always seen a black cat. You've never come across a gray cat or yellow cat or any other color cats. And so you draw the inference that all cats are black. There are no gray cats, there are no yellow cats, no brown cats. Now, that would be an inductive argument because it's not impossible that the conclusion could be false, right? You can imagine that there would be a yellow cat. You've just never actually come upon one. You've only come upon black cats. You know, the only data you have is that all cats are black. And that's a very sort of a general way of thinking about inductive arguments. Another version of this kind of argument would be, suppose that every single time you've ever been in a Catholic church, you've always seen a statue of a woman crying, right? You've been in lots and lots of Catholic churches. Maybe even it's the case that you grew up Catholic and you went to Catholic churches every day of your life. So you've got a lot of data available to you. And so then you draw the inference that the next Catholic church that you go into, of course, one that you've never been into before, the next new Catholic church that you go into, there will also be a statue of a woman crying. Now, is it possible that that conclusion could be false? Is it possible? Can you imagine a hypothetical world where you actually do go into some other Catholic church and it's not the case that there's a statue of a woman crying? Yeah, that's definitely a possibility, right? I can imagine that sort of situation, which means that we only have probability that the conclusion is true. We don't have a guarantee of its certainty. In fact, in these two cases, it seems as though these aren't even necessarily good inductive arguments, right? Because there are plenty of cats that are not black. And likewise, presumably, there's plenty of Catholic church without statues of women crying. And so even though these are inductive arguments, they're not necessarily cogent inductive arguments. So inductive arguments actually really reflect a lot of what we do in the sciences. Generally speaking, in the sciences, we have some phenomenon that we've observed, and we're trying to make sense of that phenomenon. We go and we collect a bunch of data, and we go and perform experiments, and we try to make sense of that data that we collect from those experiments, and then we try to draw certain inferences given the data that we've collected, right? We're trying to make some claim about what has not been seen based upon the things that we have seen. That's kind of what we do when we're working with the scientific method. At least that's one way of approaching this point. And so what that means is that the conclusion that we infer from the data isn't going to be a guarantee, right? If we have some scientific theory, it could always be disproven by some further information that we collect, some further data that we collect in the future. So just because we have a really strong reason to believe that the conclusion is true, that's only a high probability. That turns out to only be a high probability. That's not an absolute guarantee. So let's look at one more argument to try to make sure that we really understand how induction is supposed to work. Consider this argument. Premise 1. Let's say you go outside and you find that all of the streets are wet. Premise 2 says it also turns out to be that all of the people are wet. And let's say that the grass is wet. And we might even say that there's another premise where it turns out that Let's say there are storm clouds on the horizon. Okay, so that's the data that we've collected. You go outside to find that all of the streets are wet, all of the people are wet, the grass is wet, and there's storm clouds out on the horizon. And so what inference do we draw from this? What conclusion do we make? Well, presumably you might conclude that, therefore, it rained. That seems like a very reasonable conclusion to draw from this. And let's say that, all of these premises are true. Let's say we can trust our senses, and it really is the case that all of the streets are wet, all of the people are wet, the grass is wet, there's storm clouds on the horizon. You're not hallucinating, you're not being tricked by an evil demon. We trust our senses. All of these premises are true. Could it be the case that the conclusion is false, even while all of these premises are true? Yeah, it looks like it could be. How? Well, instead of the fact that it rained, it might be the case that there was a big water balloon fight. Or maybe instead of the fact that it rained, maybe it's the case that the sprinklers all went on. There's lots of things that we could think about that would show that all of these premises are true and the conclusion turns out to be false. Nonetheless, it looks like this is a fairly good inference to make. It looks like it's a fairly strong argument. That does seem to be like the sort of thing that most people, myself included, would infer given all of these premises. And so what this turns out to be is an inductive argument where the conclusion seems to follow with a high probability of it being true, but not with absolute certainty, not with that kind of guarantee that we get with a deductive argument. So a deductive argument guarantees us that the conclusion must be true. It must follow from the premises necessarily. Induction does not. Induction only gives us a high probability of the truth of the conclusion. So an abductive argument is somewhat different. It's similar to induction, but instead what we do is we think about it in terms of appealing to the best explanation for some phenomenon. So let's put it in the following way. So abduction tells us that when we find some phenomenon, we've got some data, and we're trying to make sense of that data, whatever it is that X stands for. Then what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sense of or find what turns out to be the best explanation of that phenomenon of X. Maybe it's phi, maybe it's psi, maybe it's theos, whatever it might be. But now let's suppose that these are our theories and they're all equally good as theories. They all make sense of the data. They all make sense of the information that we've collected. How do we then decide which theory we should go with? What is going to be the best theory? That's when we appeal to what's sometimes called the scientific virtues. So there's lots of different ways in which we can kind of cash out what the scientific virtues are, but some of the ones that people tend to appeal to are things like simplicity. So what would be the simplest explanation? You know, if I have to add in a whole bunch of information in order to make the explanation work, all of that information is going to make the theory at hand far more complex. If you can get the job done without using all of that information, then you have a simpler theory. And perhaps that's a nice virtue to have in a theory. Another way of thinking about the scientific virtues would be elegance. Elegance is sort of what's intuitively most appealing. You don't have to sort of rack your brain. It just seems to make sense. That's very similar to simplicity, but just in terms of what fits our intuitions perhaps better than some other theory. Another scientific virtue would be prediction. Right? So perhaps I've got some scientific theories that are both very simple and very elegant, but just does a really crummy job of making any legitimate predictions. Yet on the other hand, let's say that I've got some other theory, say this one right here. It gets all of the predictions right. Nonetheless, it does not seem to be the simplest theory, and it may not even be the most elegant theory. Does that tell us that we should go with that theory instead? Now, these are just some of the different virtues that we sometimes talk about with regard to different scientific theories. But the main point that I want you to pay attention to is abduction is a way in which someone would appeal to a different explanation as being a better explanation. And how do we understand something to be a better explanation than something else? That's where we look at these sort of scientific virtues to understand what theories would do a better job of explaining the phenomenon that we're interested in.